You think people make you lose control. You think it is the comment, the disrespect, the tone, the attitude. But that is not what is really happening. The truth is far more uncomfortable, and once you see it, you will not be able to ignore it again. Every time you get irritated, something inside you is being exposed. Not your strength, not your intelligence, your dependency, your need for things to go the way you expect, your silent demand for respect, validation, control. And when reality refuses to obey you, you react. Look closely at your last moment of irritation. It was not just about what happened, it was about what you believed should not have happened. That gap between expectation and reality is where irritation is born. Not in the world, inside you. This is why two people can face the exact same situation and respond in completely different ways. One remains calm, almost unaffected. The other explodes, carries the feeling for hours, sometimes days. The situation did not change. The mind did. You were never taught this. You were taught to control what happens around you, to avoid discomfort, to defend your position, to prove your point. But no one told you that the more you try to control the outside, the easier it becomes for anything outside to control you. And here is the part most people do not want to hear. As long as your peace depends on how others behave, you do not have peace. You have a fragile agreement with the world, and that agreement breaks constantly. This is why you feel drained. Why small things affect you more than they should. Why certain people seem to have power over your emotions without even trying. It is not because they are stronger. It is because your mind is still negotiating with reality instead of accepting it. The Stoics understood something most people never realize. Your irritation is not a reaction. It is a signal. A signal that you are still giving away control of your internal state. And once you understand that, everything begins to shift. Because the goal is not to suppress your emotions. It is not to pretend you do not feel. It is to reach a point where what others do no longer dictates how you exist, and that is where most people fail. They try to manage reactions instead of eliminating the cause. What you are about to understand is not just how to stay calm, it is how to remove the very mechanism that makes irritation possible. And once you see it clearly, you will realize something that changes everything. You were never losing control. You were giving it away. You believe irritation happens in the moment. Someone says something, does something, and then you react. It feels immediate, automatic, almost justified. But what if the reaction did not start in that moment? What if it was already built inside you long before anything happened? Irritation is not created by the situation. It is activated by it. The real source is the structure of your expectations. Every time you walk into a conversation, a relationship, a simple interaction, you carry invisible rules about how things should go. People should respect you. They should understand you. They should behave in a certain way. And most of the time, you are not even aware that you are carrying these rules. Now pay attention to what happens when reality does not follow them. The moment someone breaks one of these internal expectations, your mind interprets it as a problem. Not because it is objectively wrong, but because it conflicts with the version of reality you created in your head. That conflict generates tension. That tension becomes irritation. This is why small things can affect you so deeply. It is never just about the action itself. It is about the meaning you attach to it. A delayed response becomes disrespect. A different opinion becomes a personal attack. A mistake becomes incompetence. Your mind is constantly translating reality based on what you expect it to be, not what it is. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus explained this in a way that most people ignore. In the Enchiridion, chapter 5, he teaches that it is not events that disturb us, but our judgments about them. This is not just philosophy. It is a direct description of how your mind operates every single day. Think about that carefully. If your judgment creates the disturbance, then the situation itself does not have the power you think it has. The power comes from your interpretation. And if the interpretation changes, the reaction changes. But here is where it becomes uncomfortable. If your irritation comes from your interpretation, then you are responsible for it. not the other person, not the situation. You. Most people resist this idea because it removes the comfort of blaming the outside world. It forces you to look inward and admit that your reactions are not as justified as they feel. And that is exactly why they remain stuck in the same emotional patterns for years. You do not get irritated because people are difficult. You get irritated because you expect them not to be. You expect consistency, logic, respect, alignment with your values. But people are unpredictable. They act based on their own fears, beliefs, limitations. When you expect them to behave according to your standards, you create a constant conflict with reality. And this conflict drains you. Not because the world is against you, but because you are resisting the nature of the world itself. Now consider a different approach. What happens if you remove the expectation? What happens if you stop assuming that people should act in a certain way? The situation does not change. The person does not change. But your reaction loses its foundation. Without expectation, there is nothing to be violated. And without violation, there is no trigger for irritation. This does not mean you accept everything passively. It means you see things as they are before deciding how to respond. You stop reacting from assumption and start responding from clarity. And this is the shift that changes everything. The moment you understand that irritation is built on expectation, you gain the ability to dismantle it at its root. Because if expectation creates the reaction, removing expectation removes the reaction. And once you see that clearly, a deeper question begins to emerge. If irritation is not caused by others, then what inside you still needs them to behave a certain way? You may believe your irritation is justified. Someone crossed a line, disrespected you, ignored you, or acted in a way that feels unacceptable. It feels personal. It feels direct. It feels like something you should not tolerate. But what if the reaction you call strength is actually a weakness you have never questioned? Behind almost every irritation, there is something quiet, almost invisible operating in the background. It is not logic. It is not reason. It is your ego. Not in the exaggerated sense of arrogance, but in the subtle need to protect an image of yourself that you have built over time. You have an internal identity, a version of who you believe you are, someone who deserves respect, someone who should be heard, someone who should not be treated in certain ways. And when reality challenges that identity, your mind reacts as if something important is under attack. This is why irritation feels immediate. It is not just about the situation. It is about defending a version of yourself. The moment someone contradicts you, ignores you, or behaves in a way that does not align with how you see yourself, your ego interprets it as a threat, and that threat demands a response. The Stoic philosopher Seneca addressed this clearly in On Anger, Book 1, Chapter 2. He explains that anger is not a reflex, but a decision that follows a judgment. First, you interpret the situation as an offense. Then, you accept that interpretation. Only after that does the emotional reaction take over. This means irritation is not as automatic as it feels. There is a moment, often invisible, where your mind decides that what happened should not have happened. That decision fuels everything that comes next. Now consider how often this happens in your daily life. Someone interrupts you and you feel disrespected. Someone disagrees with you and you feel challenged. Someone ignores you and you feel diminished. But in all these situations, what is actually being attacked is not you. It is your expectation of how you should be treated. Your ego does not want neutrality. It wants confirmation. It wants to feel validated, acknowledged, secure. And when it does not receive that, it reacts by creating irritation, as if that reaction could restore control. But it never does. In reality, every time you react this way, you reinforce the same pattern. You teach your mind that your emotional state depends on external validation. You strengthen the very mechanism that keeps you vulnerable to the behavior of others. This is the trap. The more you try to defend your ego, the more fragile it becomes. The more you demand respect, the more dependent you become on receiving it. And the more dependent you are, the easier it is for anyone to disturb your peace. Now imagine removing that need. Not by forcing yourself to accept everything, but by understanding that your identity does not require constant defense. What someone says or does not define you unless you allow it to. When you stop protecting your ego at every moment, something unexpected happens. Situations that once triggered you begin to lose their intensity. Words lose their weight. Actions lose their ability to provoke you. Not because the world changed, but because you are no longer reacting from a place that needs validation. This is not weakness. This is control. And once you begin to see how much of your irritation comes from protecting an image, a deeper realization starts to form. If your ego is what reacts, then who are you when you no longer need to defend it? You say you want control. You say you want peace. You say you want to stop reacting to everything. But when the moment comes, when someone disrespects you, ignores you, or challenges you, everything you believe collapses in seconds. That is the test. Not what you understand in calm moments, but how you behave when reality refuses to cooperate. Picture this clearly. Someone speaks to you with a tone you do not like. Maybe they dismiss your opinion. Maybe they act as if you do not matter. In that exact moment, something happens inside you. Your body tightens. Your mind accelerates. Thoughts begin to form. You feel the urge to respond, to correct, to defend, to prove something. Now stop and observe what is actually happening. Nothing physical has harmed you. Nothing has taken anything from you. And yet, your internal state shifts as if something serious has occurred. That reaction is not caused by the event itself. It is caused by the meaning you assign to it in real time. This is the moment most people fail. They believe that feeling is truth. They assume that because they feel disrespected, they are being disrespected. Because they feel attacked, they are being attacked. But feelings are not evidence. They are interpretations shaped by your conditioning, your expectations, your ego. The Stoic emperor Marcus Aurelius wrote in Meditations, Book 8, paragraph 47, that if you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it. And this estimate, you have the power to revoke at any moment. That is the test. Not controlling others, but controlling your estimate of what happens. When someone acts in a way you do not like, you have two options. The first is the automatic path. You accept the initial interpretation your mind creates. You react. You justify it. You carry it. You repeat the pattern. The second is the conscious path. You interrupt the process. You question the interpretation before it becomes a reaction. You ask yourself one simple question. Is this situation truly harming me? Or is it only challenging how I think it should be? That question creates space. And in that space, control becomes possible. Most people never create that space. They move from stimulus to reaction without awareness. That is why they feel controlled by others. Not because others are powerful, but because they never pause long enough to take back control. Understand this clearly. Every moment of irritation is a test of your perception. Not your patience, not your tolerance, your perception. If your perception is rigid, reality will constantly disturb you. If your perception is flexible, reality loses its ability to control your internal state. And this is where everything begins to change, because once you realize that your reaction is based on interpretation, not reality, you start to see something deeper. You are not reacting to what happened. You are reacting to what you think it means. And that leads to a question most people avoid. If your interpretation creates your reaction, then how much of your suffering is self-created? You say you want peace, but your actions reveal something different. You do not just want calm. You want recognition. You want to be understood. You want people to act the way you believe they should. And when that does not happen, you call it frustration, irritation, injustice. But look deeper. What you call irritation is often resistance. Not resistance to what happened, but resistance to accepting that you cannot control how others think, speak, or behave. This is the truth most people avoid. You are not disturbed because of the situation. You are disturbed because reality did not match your preference. And instead of adjusting your perspective, you try to fight what already happened. That fight is what exhausts you. Every time you replay a conversation in your head, every time you think about what you should have said, every time you imagine how things should have gone, you are not solving anything. You are reinforcing the idea that reality should be different from what it is. The Stoic Emperor Marcus Aurelius makes this clear in Meditations, Book 4, Paragraph 3. He explains that you have power over your mind, not outside events. Once you understand this, you will find strength. But most people do not accept this. They hear it, they agree with it, but they do not apply it. Because applying it requires letting go of something they are attached to. The need to be right. Think about how many times irritation comes from disagreement. Not because the situation is serious, but because someone sees things differently. And instead of observing that difference, your mind tries to correct it, to impose your view, to prove your position. Why? Because being right feels like control, and losing that feeling creates discomfort. So you react, you argue, you defend, you hold on, not because it improves anything, but because it protects your sense of certainty. This is where most people remain stuck for years. They do not realize that their need to be right is what keeps them in conflict, not just with others, but with reality itself. Now consider what happens if you release that need. If you no longer require others to agree with you, their words lose their weight. If you no longer need validation, their opinions lose their power. If you no longer fight reality, situations stop feeling like threats. This is not passive acceptance. This is clarity. You begin to see that most of what disturbs you is not essential. It is noise created by expectations, amplified by ego, and sustained by resistance. And when that noise fades, something unexpected takes its place. Stability, not because the world became easier, but because you stopped demanding that it should be. This leads to a critical shift. If your suffering comes from resisting reality, then your peace comes from understanding what you can and cannot control. And that is where the foundation of real control begins. At some point you realize that trying to control the world is exhausting. People do not behave the way you expect. Situations do not unfold the way you plan. Outcomes do not always match your effort. And every time you try to force reality into your preferences, you create tension that turns into irritation. This is where the Stoics introduce a principle that, once understood, reorganizes the way you experience everything. There are things you control and things you do not. It sounds simple, but most people never apply it correctly. You do not control what others think. You do not control how they speak. You do not control their tone, their opinions, their actions, or their intentions. You do not control delays, misunderstandings, or unexpected outcomes. These belong to a category that exists completely outside your authority. And yet, this is exactly where most people invest their energy. They try to manage impressions. They try to anticipate reactions. They try to correct behavior. They try to shape outcomes that depend on variables they cannot command. And when this fails, which it always does, irritation appears. Not because something went wrong, but because control was expected where it does not exist. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus explains in the Enchiridion, Chapter 1, that some things are up to us, and some are not. Our opinions, impulses, desires, and reactions are within our control. Everything else is not. If you ignore this distinction, your mind becomes scattered. You react to everything because everything feels like your responsibility. You try to fix what is not yours to fix. You take personally what was never about you. But when you apply this principle with precision, something changes immediately. You stop wasting energy. Instead of reacting to what others do, you observe. Instead of trying to control outcomes, you focus on your response. Instead of being pulled in multiple directions, your attention becomes stable. Now consider a situation that normally irritates you. Someone speaks in a way you dislike. Before, you would react, correct, defend, or carry that feeling. Now you apply the principle. Is their tone under your control? No. Is your reaction under your control? Yes. That single distinction removes the illusion that you need to respond emotionally. It creates a boundary between what happens and how you choose to engage with it. This is not about indifference, it is about accuracy. You are aligning your energy with what is actually within your reach. And when you do this consistently, irritation loses its foundation, because irritation depends on the belief that you should control what you cannot. Remove that belief, and the reaction has nowhere to stand. This is where real control begins, not by dominating situations but by directing your own mind with clarity. And once that becomes stable, the next step is not just understanding this principle, but turning it into something you apply automatically, even under pressure. Because knowing what to do is not enough. You need a way to act on it in real time. Understanding the principle is not enough. In the moment when pressure rises, your mind will try to return to old patterns. That is why you need clear actions that interrupt the reaction before it takes control. The first practice is the conscious pause. When something triggers you, your instinct is to respond immediately. That is the moment you lose control. Instead, you delay your reaction on purpose, not to suppress what you feel, but to prevent your first impulse from becoming your final decision. The Stoic philosopher Seneca writes in On Anger, Book 2, Chapter 29, that the greatest remedy for anger is delay. That delay creates space, and in that space, you regain control. The second practice is reinterpretation. What you feel is based on what you think the situation means. Change the meaning, and the emotion changes with it. Instead of assuming disrespect, you consider alternative explanations. Maybe the person is distracted. Maybe they are unaware. Maybe it has nothing to do with you. This is not denial. It is flexibility. And flexibility weakens the automatic reaction. The third practice is the reduction of expectation. Most irritation comes from assuming that people should behave according to your standards. When you lower that expectation, you stop being surprised by behavior that is common. People are inconsistent. They make mistakes. They act emotionally. When you accept this as normal, you remove the trigger that creates frustration. The fourth practice is emotional distancing. This does not mean detachment from reality. It means observing without absorbing. You see what happens, but you do not internalize it as a personal event. The Stoic emperor Marcus Aurelius reflects in Meditations, Book 6, paragraph 52, that things outside the mind do not touch the soul unless the mind allows them to. This is the difference between witnessing and reacting. The fifth practice is radical acceptance of reality. Not passive acceptance, but accurate recognition. What happened has already happened. Resisting it only prolongs the disturbance. Accepting it does not mean you agree with it. It means you stop wasting energy trying to change something that is already fixed in the past. Once you accept it, you can decide your next move with clarity. These practices are simple, but they are not easy. They require repetition. They require awareness. And most importantly, they require that you take responsibility for your internal state, instead of assigning that responsibility to others. When applied together, they create a system, a way of thinking and acting that interrupts irritation before it forms. Over time, this becomes automatic. The situations do not disappear, but your reactions change so consistently that irritation stops being your default response. And when that shift begins to stabilize, something deeper becomes possible. You no longer try to control reactions. You start to become someone who does not need to react. Up to this point, you have been trying to manage what you feel. You pause, you reinterpret, you lower expectations, you create distance, you accept reality. These practices work, but they still operate at the level of reaction. They assume that irritation will appear and that you must deal with it. There is a deeper level. Instead of asking how to control reactions, you change the type of person who reacts. Most people build their identity around sensitivity to the outside world. They define themselves through how others treat them, how situations unfold, how outcomes affect them. Their emotional state is tied to external variables, and because of that, it fluctuates constantly. The Stoic approach is different. It is not about becoming indifferent. It is about becoming internally stable. The Stoic emperor Marcus Aurelius reflects in Meditations, Book 2, paragraph 1, that you will encounter difficult people, ungrateful people, and selfish people. Not as an exception, but as a rule. When you accept this as part of reality, you stop expecting the world to behave differently, and your reactions begin to lose intensity. This is where identity shifts. Instead of seeing yourself as someone who must respond to everything, you begin to see yourself as someone who remains unchanged by most things. Your focus moves inward. Your standard becomes internal. You measure yourself not by how others act, but by how consistent you remain regardless of what happens. This changes the way you interpret every situation. A comment that once triggered you becomes irrelevant. A disagreement becomes just a difference in perspective. A moment of disrespect becomes a reflection of the other person, not a definition of you. You are no longer trying to control the situation. You are embodying a state that is not easily disturbed. This is not suppression. Suppression requires effort and creates tension. This is alignment. When your identity is built on internal control, reactions lose their urgency because they no longer serve a purpose. You do not need to prove anything. You do not need to correct everything. You do not need to respond to everything. You choose when to act, how to act, and if action is even necessary. And that choice is what most people never develop. They react because they feel compelled to react. You remain steady because you are no longer compelled. Over time, this becomes your default state, not because you force it, but because your perception, your expectations, and your priorities have changed at the root. And when that happens, something becomes clear. It is not that nothing affects you, it is that very little deserves to. And that leads to the final realization. At the beginning, it felt like the problem was outside. People, situations, unexpected events. It seemed like control depended on changing what happens around you. But now, you can see the pattern clearly. Every moment of irritation was a transfer of control. You allowed something external to define your internal state. Not because it had real power, but because your mind treated it as if it did. Now that changes. You understand that what people say belongs to them. What they think belongs to them. What they do belongs to them. None of that has authority over you unless you decide it does. And that decision happens in a moment so small that most people never notice it. But you do now. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus teaches in the Enchiridion, chapter 20, that when someone provokes you, remember that it is your own opinion that has provoked you. This is not an abstract idea. It is a direct instruction. If your opinion changes, the provocation disappears. This is where freedom begins. Not the freedom to control everything, but the freedom to remain unchanged by most things. When someone disrespects you, you evaluate. Is this within my control? No. Then it does not define my state. When something goes wrong, you evaluate again. Can I act on this? If yes, you act with clarity. If not, you release it. There is no internal conflict, because you are no longer trying to control what is not yours. This does not make you passive. It makes you precise. You act where action is possible. You remain steady where it is not. And that precision removes unnecessary reactions from your life. Over time, this becomes visible. People notice that you do not react the way others do. Situations that create tension for most people do not affect you in the same way, not because you are avoiding reality, but because you are no longer entangled in it. And this is where true control exists, not in dominating the world, but in directing yourself within it. You no longer need people to behave correctly for you to feel stable. You no longer depend on outcomes to maintain your balance. You no longer react automatically to every stimulus. Because nothing outside has the authority to control what happens inside. And once you reach this point, something becomes undeniable. You are never trying to control others. You are learning to stop being controlled. At first it feels like you are losing something. You stop reacting and it seems like you are giving up your voice, your presence, your ability to respond. It feels unfamiliar because you were used to proving yourself, correcting others, defending your position. But what you are actually losing is noise. When you stop reacting impulsively, your mind becomes clearer. You begin to see situations without distortion. You notice details you used to ignore because your attention was consumed by emotion. You start to understand people instead of immediately judging them. This is where a new kind of control appears, not control over others, but control over direction. Instead of being pulled into every situation, you choose which ones deserve your attention. Instead of responding to every comment, you decide what is worth engaging with. Instead of carrying emotional weight from one moment to the next, You let it end where it started. The Stoic philosopher Seneca explains in On the Shortness of Life, Chapter 3, that life is long enough if you know how to use it. Most people waste it reacting to things that do not matter. They give their time, their energy, their focus to events that have no real impact on their direction. When you stop reacting, you reclaim that energy. You begin to invest it differently. In your work, you are more focused because you are not distracted by minor conflicts. In your relationships, you are more stable because you are not constantly triggered. In your decisions, you are more precise because you are not influenced by temporary emotions. This creates an advantage that most people never develop. While others are reacting, you are observing. While others are arguing, you are thinking. While others are trying to prove something, you are building something. And this difference compounds over time. Days turn into weeks, weeks into months, and the gap between you and those who are still reacting becomes clear. Not because you are doing more, but because you are wasting less. But there is something else that happens. Something deeper. When you stop reacting, you begin to understand people in a way that was not possible before. You see that most reactions come from fear, insecurity, confusion. You realize that what once irritated you was often a reflection of someone else's internal struggle. This changes your perspective. You no longer see every negative behavior as something directed at you. You see it as part of a larger pattern. And that understanding removes the need to take things personally. This is where calm becomes natural. Not because you are forcing it, but because you are no longer interpreting everything as a threat. And at this point, something becomes clear. You do not need to eliminate every difficult situation. You only need to eliminate the way you used to respond to it. At the beginning, you believed control meant changing what happens outside you. You thought peace would come when people behaved correctly, when situations unfolded the way you expected, when nothing challenged your sense of order. Now you see the truth. Nothing outside was ever meant to be controlled by you, and everything inside always was. The Stoic Emperor Marcus Aurelius writes in Meditations, Book 12, paragraph 36, that your mind will take the shape of what you frequently hold in thought. This is not just a reflection, it is a warning. If you constantly focus on what others do, your mind becomes reactive. If you focus on your own response, your mind becomes stable. This is the final shift. You stop asking how to avoid irritation. You start asking what kind of mind does not produce it. Because irritation is not something that appears randomly. It is the result of patterns. Patterns of expectation, interpretation, and attachment. When those patterns change, the reaction disappears with them. You no longer wait for situations to be easy. You prepare your mind to handle them as they are. You no longer expect people to align with you. You understand that they act according to their own nature. You no longer measure your state by what happens. You measure it by how you remain, and this creates something most people never reach. Independence. Not financial, not social, mental. You are no longer dependent on outcomes to feel stable. You are no longer dependent on others to feel respected. You are no longer dependent on circumstances to maintain your balance. Because your stability does not come from what happens. It comes from how you think. And once this becomes clear, there is nothing left to prove, nothing left to defend, nothing left to react to unnecessarily. You act when action is required. You remain still when it is not. And that precision becomes your strength. This is what it means to never be irritated. Not that nothing ever challenges you, but that nothing has the power to control you unless you allow it. And once you stop allowing it, everything changes.